The neon sign of Willow Diner flickered through the misty evening of 1956. Rain drizzled softly against the windows, turning every droplet into a shimmer of red and blue light. The jukebox inside hummed quietly, playing "Love Me Tender" by Elvis Presley, its melody floating like a broken dream. Behind the counter stood Betty Lou Parker, a 22-year-old waitress with honey-brown curls and eyes that had forgotten how to rest. She wore a turquoise dress, a white apron tied around her waist, and shoes worn out from years of walking between tables. Betty had been working here for almost 3 years, ever since her father never returned from the Korean War and her mother passed away from pneumonia. She lived alone in a small room above the laundromat down the street. Her world was simple: work, home, silence, sleep, until the night Johnny Ray walked into her life. The doorbell jingled. 5 men entered, their leather jackets soaked with rain, their boots thudding like thunder. They called themselves the Steel Vultures, a motorcycle gang that ruled the nearby roads. Their leader, Johnny Ray, was tall, sharp-jawed, and had that dangerous smile that made people look twice but regret it later. Betty swallowed her fear and greeted them. "Evening, boys. What'll it be tonight?" Johnny leaned against the counter. "Well now, sugar, how about a smile first?" She smiled politely. "Coffee." He smirked. "Make it 2, 1 for me and 1 for you." The other men laughed. Betty turned to pour coffee, pretending not to hear the whistles and laughter behind her. But when she placed the cup down, Johnny flicked his cigarette into the ashtray and said, "You got pretty hands. Bet they shake easy when someone yells." Betty froze. "Excuse me." Johnny grabbed her wrist, not hard, but enough to make her heart pound. "You heard me." Before things could get worse, an older woman's voice broke the tension. "Johnny Ray, you let that girl be." It was Mrs. Jenkins, the diner's cook, 60 years old, tough as nails. She came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Johnny smiled. "Evening, ma'am. Just having some fun." "Fun ends when someone cries, Mrs. Jenkins said sharply. Johnny raised his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes lingered on Betty, cold, curious, and cruel. That night, Betty cried alone in the storage room after they left. She hated the way her hands trembled. She hated that no one had stood up for her except old Mrs. Jenkins. But most of all, she hated the feeling of fear that had crawled into her chest and refused to leave. The next few weeks passed quietly. Betty worked, smiled, and lived inside her silence. But the Steel Vultures kept returning, every Friday night, turning her peaceful diner into a place of dread. Johnny would tease her, spill his coffee on purpose, make rude jokes, and every time, she'd bite her lip and say nothing. Until one night, something changed. A stranger entered the diner, Daniel Carter, a quiet man in his 30s, wearing a worn army jacket. He ordered black coffee and apple pie, then sat by the window, watching the rain. Betty noticed the scars on his hands, the calm in his eyes. "You just passin' through?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Heading west. Trying to find work." They spoke briefly, about the town, the weather, the war. And for the first time in months, Betty laughed. But before the warmth could settle, the doorbell rang again. Johnny Ray and his gang. He spotted Betty talking to Daniel and smirked. "Well, looky here. The little waitress got herself a soldier boy." Daniel turned, his jaw tightening. "Leave her alone," he said quietly. Johnny stepped forward, his boots echoing on the tile floor. "Or what, hero?" The diner went silent. Only the sound of rain outside filled the air. Then, like thunder, Johnny shoved Daniel's shoulder. Daniel didn't fight back, not yet. He simply said, "You don't touch women like that. Ever." Johnny laughed, and swung a punch. But Daniel caught his wrist mid-air. The sudden stillness shocked everyone. He didn't hit back, he just held Johnny's arm until the man's smirk faded. Then he let go. "Get out," Daniel said. Johnny's face turned red, humiliated. "You'll regret that, soldier." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Betty stood frozen. Daniel sat back down quietly and sipped his coffee. "Sorry about that," he said. But Betty couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, tears welling up. Not because of fear, but because, for the first time, someone had stood up for her. The next few weeks brought quiet change. Daniel began coming to the diner more often. Sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for coffee. He'd help Betty carry boxes, fix the jukebox, and tell stories of the road. One night, he said, "You ever think about leaving this town?" She smiled faintly. "Every day. But dreams cost money." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Maybe not all dreams. They began walking home together after closing time. Slowly, friendship turned into something more, the kind of silent love that doesn't need words. But shadows were never far behind. Johnny Ray hadn't forgotten. One evening, he and his gang cornered Daniel behind the diner. There were 5 of them, drunk and angry. Johnny spat, "You think you can steal my girl's attention, soldier?" Daniel raised his hands. "She's not your girl, Johnny. She's not anyone's." Johnny's fist came flying. A fight broke out, brutal and quick. Daniel managed to take 2 men down, but a blow from a wrench caught him on the shoulder. When Betty found him minutes later, lying beside the dumpster, bleeding, she screamed. She ran to him, held his head in her lap, tears mixing with the rain. "Daniel, please, stay with me." He smiled weakly. "Told you dreams don't always need money." The sheriff came. The men were arrested, but Johnny used his connections to get bail. The town whispered, gossiped, but no one stood up. Except Betty. At the trial hearing, she testified, voice trembling, but heart steady. "Yes, he hurt Daniel. He's hurt me for months. But he doesn't scare me anymore." Johnny sneered across the courtroom, but she met his eyes without flinching. Afterward, Daniel left town for treatment, promising he'd return. Betty stayed, running the diner, alone but stronger. Months passed. The neon sign still flickered every night, but something inside her had changed. She smiled again, not because life was easy, but because she had survived. And one rainy evening, the bell over the door jingled again. Daniel walked in, holding a small suitcase and a tired smile. "Still serving coffee?" he asked. Betty's eyes filled with tears. "Only for my favorite customer." He sat at his old booth. "I found work in Chicago. They need someone to manage a diner." She froze, heart pounding. He smiled. "Thought maybe you'd come with me." The jukebox started playing, "Can't Help Falling in Love." Betty looked at the counter, the same place where she once trembled with fear, and then at the man who'd reminded her she was worth standing up for. She untied her apron slowly, folded it, and said softly,